confirmando. Paulinho, e Paula, eu passo para você, né, Paula? As perguntas que vierem do YouTube, né?
Isso, passa para mim.
Tá ótimo, pode deixar. E você fica de olho aqui nas do chat, né? Do Zoom mesmo.
Fico.
Perfeito.
Obrigada, Igor.
Estamos ao vivo.
Pode admitir todo mundo?
Só um instante. So we're gonna create the link for YouTube and then we will get started. We're already started. Okay.
Ok, então vou começar, né? So I'm gonna speak briefly in Portuguese, then I'll switch to English. Então sejam bem-vindos ao segundo dia do nosso seminário A Vida Psíquica da Política Internacional. Antes da gente começar, eu gostaria de lembrar que o seminário conta com tradução simultânea, português e inglês, que é realizada por intérpretes em treinamento do curso de formação de intérpretes de conferências da PUC-Rio. A gente agradece a equipe pela disposição e pelo auxílio indispensável para a boa realização desse evento. E caso vocês queiram ativar a tradução, vocês clicam nesse ícone de um globo na parte inferior à direita do Zoom e selecionam a língua para a qual vocês precisam de tradução. E ativem também a opção desativar som original para não ficar ouvindo, né, o som original e a tradução. Para voltar a ouvir os palestrantes na língua original, vocês clicam novamente no globo e selecionam a opção Off. Now I'll switch to English. Welcome to the second day of our seminar, The Psychic Life of International Politics. Before we proceed, I would like to remind you that there is a simultaneous translation between Portuguese and English for the seminar, enabled by the team of trainee interpreters from the Conference Interpreted Training Program of PUC-Rio. We thank the team for their availability and hard work, without which these encounters would be quite difficult. For the translation to work smoothly, we ask everyone to speak slowly. And if you need to activate the translation, just click on the globe icon on the bottom right of your Zoom and select the language into which you need the translation. Then select Mute Original Audio. To get back to hearing the speakers in the original language, just click on the same globe and select Off. Okay, continuing yesterday's very fruitful discussions, today, we'll talk about three different yet connected ways through which affective energies are mobilized and activated for collective politics: nationalisms, populisms, and insurgencies. For that, we have invited three very distinguished speakers whose work have been influencing many discussions we have here at the Institute of International Relations at PUC-Rio. So I will first introduce our speakers and then the floor will be theirs. First, we have Hagar Kotef, who is a senior lecturer in political theory and comparative political thought. Her research interests are political theory, Israel-Palestine, settler colonialism, feminist theory, and liberalism and its critiquea, specifically post-structural and post-colonial. Her most recent book, The Colonizing Self, or Home and Homelessness in Israel-Palestine, examines the constructions of political belonging in settler colonies. It investigates how people develop attachment to space, not despite violence or by denying it, but rather through violence. The book was published in 2020 by Duke University Press. Her previous book, Movement and the Ordering of Freedom, Duke University Press, 2015, charts the conceptual history of mobility and immobility in the history of political thought and the structuring of political spaces, from the writings of Locke, Hobbes, and Mill to the sophisticated technologies of control that circumscribe the lives of Palestinians in the Occupy West Bank. Before joining the School for Oriental and African Studies, she held positions and fellowships at the Minerva Humanities Center at Tel Aviv University, the Department of Politics and Government at Ben-Gurion University, Columbia University Society of Fellows, and the University of California, Berkeley. And I would like to add that recently, in a course taught by Jimmy, Paulinho, and I to our postgraduate students, we have included her article, Violent Attachments, published in 2019 in Political Theory in our syllabus. And it has left a very positive impression in us, in our students. So we're very excited to have Hagar Kotef here in person. Our second speaker will be Rodrigo Nunes, who spoke in yesterday's panel. For the benefit of those who were not here yesterday, Rodrigo is a professor of modern and contemporary philosophy at the philosophy department at PUC-Rio, the author of Organization of the Organizationless, Collective Action After Networks, published by Mute PML Books in 2014, and Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, A Theory of Political Organization, out this month with Verso, and of several articles in journals such as Le Temps Moderne, Radical Philosophy, Crisis and Critique, International Journal of Communication, Serrote, and South Atlantic Quarterly. More recently, he organized a dossier on Brazil under Bolsonaro for radical philosophy. He has been a visiting lecturer at Goldsmith College, University of London, where he received his PhD in philosophy, the University of East London, and the University of Westminster, as well as a visiting researcher at Brown University. His research interests include the ontological turn in contemporary philosophy and anthropology, cybernetics and systems theory, theories of transindividuality and the role of affects in politics, self-organization, and the question of political organization, the problem of immanence and perspectivism. We have been collaborating with Rodrigo at least since 2019, when Paulinho and I took his course, Affect, Politics, and Transindividuality. Since then, he has given a mini course and talks at events promoted by the Institute of International Relations. And as you can probably tell, we really like what Rodrigo has to say about affective aspects of contemporary politics. So we have invited him again to speak at our seminar twice. Finally, we have Yannis Stavrakakis. Yannis Tavakakis studied political science at Pantheon University in Athens and received his MA degree from the Ideology and Discourse Analysis program at the University of Essex, where he also completed his PhD. He has worked at universities of Essex and Nottingham before taking up a position at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in 2006. His research primarily focused on contemporary political theory, with emphasis on psychoanalytic and post-structuralist approaches, and on the analysis of ideology and discourse in late modern societies, with emphasis on populism, environmentalism, nationalism, and post-democracy. He's the author of Lacan and the Political, published by Routledge in 1999, and The Lacanian Left, published by Edinburgh University Press and Suning Press in 2007, and co-editor of the books Discourse Theory and Political Analysis, Lacan and Science, Aspects of Censorship in Greece, and the Political and Contemporary Art. He has co-authored with Nicholas Stavrakakis, Populism, Anti-Populism and Crisis. He has served as Vice President of the Hellenic Political Science Association and co-convener of Populism Specialist Group of the British Political Studies Association. During the period of 2014-15, he headed the research project Populisms, Populist Discourse and Democracy, and his most recent publications include the introductory study, Populism, Myths, Stereotypes and Reorientation, published by Hellenic Open University Press in 2019, and the edited volume, Routledge Handbook of Psychoanalytic Political Theory, published in 2020. Those who have taken my undergraduate and postgraduate courses and those who have been supervised by me and have taken part in our psychoanalysis and politics study group know how much I admire his work. We have read Lacan and the Political, Lacanian Left, his articles on populism, and we have begun to read chapters from the Routledge Handbook of Psychoanalytical Political Theory. So I'm delighted to have you here. So just finally, those of you who are watching us on Zoom can write your questions to our panelists on chat, and those of you on YouTube can also post your questions there. We will collect them and post them to our speakers after their talks. So let's begin hearing from Hagar Kotef.
Thank you, Paula, for this introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me here. I wish it was indeed here, in which we all share an actual space in person, as you said. But this is great as well. What I wanted to present today is a segment from the new book. In a way, the article you read is an encapsulation of its entire argument, so some of it should resonate already. I should probably say generally that the book is primarily about the effectual conditions of settler colonialism. So you talked about several international orders. The one I think about the most is settler colonialism, but I'll say something to this in a second. So the book asks how one can develop senses of belonging to land and to people amidst and even through destruction. And when I say destruction, what I mean is the destruction one produces rather than the destruction from which one suffers. In other words, my question is, how can one develop an attachment to a place that subsequently or even consequently is transformed into a site of violence? And to put it very bluntly, the book seeks to offer what I refer to as a theory of the dispossessor, to complement in a way the many theories we have of the migrant, the refugee, the dispossessed. And it tries to do so through this effectual theory that I encapsulate in the figure of the home. So home for me, it is a book about homes, and home for me is both a territorial unit and an anchor of attachment and subject formation. And what is important for me in this concept is precisely this effectual link, this encapsulation in a single concept, in a single site of the territorial and psychological. And in this sense, I was really happy to be invited to this concept because it is about the psychic life of, in a way, international relations. This is what the project is all about. So again, I'm thanking you for thinking of me. Now, I think of dispossession, as I said, primarily through the framework of settler colonialism, when land is the primary, or what is the primary stake, what is primarily at stake. And I assume that I can say it really quickly. I assume that you're familiar with the distinctions between colonialism and settler colonialism, but if not, maybe we can unpack it more slowly later. The important thing for me to say is that settler colonialism is not the only international order to which property in the land is actually key. This is the case also with capitalism. And unsurprisingly, the two have been tightly linked together, both historically and conceptually. In the book itself, this link between settler colonialism and capitalism is marked via John Locke. For him, I think now quite famously, expansionist modes of agriculture were the hinge in a way around which both settlement in America and new form of accumulative capitalism were justified. But this is the case, I should note, with many others. So in a way, Locke was an easy protagonist here, maybe because he's so famous and because he's so blunt about it. But we can see similar links also with others who were less enthusiastic supporters of colonial expansion. So for example, Smith, who was a fierce objector of imperialism and conquest and slavery, et cetera, for Smith, settler colonialism was nevertheless something to support. And this linkage is not accidental, I think, because of this logic of land accumulation. So in a way, even though I'm thinking primarily about settler colonialism, we cannot but think these two orders together. This entanglement of orders works across many layers. And in the book, I just chart them and maybe pull just a few of these threads. And I guess most importantly, and most obviously, capitalism drives and explains settler colonialism's expansionist tendencies. So whereas settlers need land to settle, they cannot be settlers if they have no land. They do not necessarily need more and more land. This need of accumulation, this need of expansion is a capitalist need, or rather a capitalist desire rather than a need. And given that this conference's subject, I want to go quickly through or alongside this idea of desire as a hinge or an axis through which these two orders flow into each other, if you'd like. So first, as I said, a capitalist desire is what drives colonial expansions. Also in the case of settler colonialism, and Marx already showed us or told us or taught us, this is the case in colonialism and imperialism. But this works in the other direction too, I think. Land is not merely a matter of profit. The land for settlement, unlike, for example, the land for mining, in the case of more classic colonialism, is itself an object of desire that is not reducible to monetary value. It has more intimate values attached to it. It is the means, it is a symbol, it is a component of how settlers attached to both senses of who they are and to their political communities and histories. Now, presumably, we have here two different modes or two different orders of desire. Presumably, capitalist consumption and in a way, capitalist desire is organized according to a logic of substitution. Consumption can continue to serve capitalist production only as long as we can keep substituting, right? I substitute my old phone for a new one, my old car for a new car, my old trousers for new trousers, etc., etc. Now, so I think substitution is politically important as a structure in this particular case, or as a foundation for my particular question about attachment to violence. Because if we think with Butler, the repetition, which is essential for the practices of substitution, opens potential gaps, disorders, failures within the logic of attachment that render it more fluid and thus potentially more amendable for political change. At the same time, presumably at stake in settler colonialism is precisely the lack of the possibility of substitution, precisely the lack of possibility of substituting the object of attachment, that is territory. Now, part of the ideology subtending settler colonialism is that the land precisely cannot be substituted, that is the settler's home. Presumably opposite to capitalism, in settler colonialism, the singularity of the territory, its irreplaceability, is the political principle that drives and justifies settlements, and therefore renders the bind more stuck, if you'd like. Yet the difference does not hold, and the mechanism of substitutions often remains an unrealized potential, even in capitalism itself. In this sense, and here I borrow Lorraine Berland's words, which are themselves borrowed from Freud, the book, my book, but as Berland says, also her book, and she says this in Cruel Optimism, and I quote her, politicizes Freud's observation that people never willingly abandon a libidinal position, not even indeed when a substitute is already beckoning to them. And we can ask later on in what sense there is a substitute beckoning in the case of settler colonialism and what forms of substitution. But I guess here is where I get to the main argument of the book, or its main question. This libidinal position, this insistence on sense of self, on permanency of the objects, etc., this remains persistence in both orders, also when, and I should say that this is always the case in both capitalism and settler colonialism. So it remains persistence also when it becomes tangled with violence to the extent that the two cannot be separated anymore. And in settler colonialism, it is about the necessary project of elimination linked to it, as Patrick Wolf taught us. And in capitalism, this violence has to do with the orders of production, exploitation, and destruction. And the point, I guess, is that these attachments persist. And this is probably the main crucial intervention I want to make. These attachments persist even after this violence becomes apparent. They are not abandoned or become untethered once people realize the degree to which they are invested in violent orders. Now, since I cannot fully unfold this matrix of attachments to violence or attachments that facilitate or justify violence, and there is also kind of a gradation here. So since I cannot do this fully in the time I have, I want to give you one moment from the book that I think carries some of the theoretical stakes. So I'm going to introduce it with a quote. Maybe I'm going to even share the screen with you. Anyway, it's from a play by Lorraine Hansberry called Les Blancs, the Whites. And the words I'm going to share with you are the words of Major Vice of the Colonial Reserve, a figure in the play who has been in many accounts of the play typified through his brutality and explicit racism and violence. But in the stage directions for the paragraph I'm about to read, he is described as, and I quote, "a man perplexed and embarrassed who desires, like all of us, sympathy." And let me see if I can share this with you. Okay, so I read. "It may surprise you, sir, but I do not enjoy my present role. I'm not by temperament an adventurous sort or a harsh one. I have become a military man only because the times demand it. This is my country, you see. I came here when I was a boy. I worked hard. I married here. I have 2 lovely daughters. This is our home, Mr. Morris. It isn't a question of empire, you see. It is our home. The right to bring up our children with culture and grace, a bit of music after dinner and a glass of decent wine. The right to watch the sun goes down over our beautiful hills. And they are beautiful, aren't they? Right, so you can see here, right, the attachment and value of the hills, of the space, way beyond and above the monetary value of the land. We wish the black snow ill, but it is our home, Mr. Morris. So Weiss insists he is not a harsh man, and he's attributed by Hansberry a certain sadness that comes to accompany his violent identity at this moment of the play. And yet he represents most concretely the violence of settlement, which I should note comes in the play in many forms and many gradients. Some of them are much more progressive than others. It is the structure rather than his individual trait that renders Weiss' identity violent, the times that demand it, but also the fact that this is my country, an insistence on belonging amidst a process of decolonization, which is precisely what times means in this particular context. So whereas he maintains that this is not a question of empire, he portrays his home via familiar imperial tropes such as culture, grace, even decent wine. And it is empire that renders his very identity, his home, a form of violence. This is why a but must arrive between the claim, "we wish the black snow ill," and "this is our home." And the 2 parts of the sentence are separated also by a long dash after the but that asks us to pause and ponder perhaps on the necessary connection between this form of homemaking and causing, even if not wishing, harm. But still, I would like to contend that there is something in these words, almost a plea for recognition supported by the stage direction, that foregrounds the tragedy of Weiss himself, the tragedy which is settlement, the rendering of one's homes or one's being into a tool of dispossession, if not death. And whereas it is difficult to talk here about a tragedy, given the destruction Weiss generates, it is this impasse in identity and placedness that I want to probe. And to do this in a slightly more digestible way, I want to introduce another figure another figure in the play who captures the same tragedy, even if somewhat differently. This is Madame Nielsen, who is the white figure in the play that represents everything that rice is not, everything that is the opposite of rice, of colonial rice. So she came to the colony to share the land and adapt to its habitus, opposite to rice, but also many others who come to change the land and impose European ways of life. She forms deep friendships with the locals. She learns from them rather than trying to teach them. And I can go on and on, but if you're familiar with Veracini or Mamdani or Woolf's distinctions between settlers and migrants, you can hear in these descriptions precisely this difference. Anyway, at the end of the play, when the struggle for decolonization escalates, I never said that the play is about an imaginary African state that goes through decolonization. And as the play progresses, the struggle for decolonization escalates and escalates. And towards the end of the play, Madame Nielsen sits outside her home with Tshembe, who is one of the main Black African heroes of the play. And then he asks her, "Will you stay on then?" And she replies, and I quote, "At my age, one goes home only to die, and I'm already home," end quote. So much like rice, Madame Nielsen's home is a space for which violence is a defining element. But if his home is defined by the violent aggressions it necessitates, her is a site of her own death. Our country, and I quote again, "Our country needs warrior." She urges Tshembe to join the fight, knowing very well that her home is the target of the next attack. Refusal of the colonial structure, a refusal that I think is so beautifully embedded here in the word our country, which is so different than Rice's "my country" or "our home." This refusal demands that she renounces herself, that she does away with herself. One must live or die. And Madame Nielsen prefers dying over living, one form of self-negation over another. Now, I must admit that I'm not entirely sure where it leaves us in terms of the political lesson of the play or of this moment I chose to share with you. I do not, and I cannot call here for either individual, collective, or political suicide. I also do not think living is a valid option, at least if we think of the Israeli-Palestinian context, but probably in most other settler contexts as well. Living is the privilege of the few who can afford living and integrating elsewhere. I also do not and cannot refuse the possibility of alliances, of a shared future, of a horizon where people can live together or separately, but still live protected from the violence of each other or the violence of the state. I want to be able to imagine a future in which the just solution for one is not the destruction of another. But all I have to work with in this section is Madame Nielsen's death. Now, analogies must come to an end somewhere, one may contend, in order to move us forward. But I'm not quite sure we've reached this end. For now then, let's stay with the fact that their home, the place of their longing, belonging, and love, is for both Rice and Nielsen a place of death, violence, and in different way, loathing. Now, with Rice, this loathing and death and violence are externalized, right? He loathes and kills Black Africans and not himself. This does not settle the paradox of violent belonging and attachment because Rice too seems to not like that much his identity as a violent person, but it does allow some mitigation, I guess. However, with Madame Nielsen, the tension is more difficult to settle, it seems. How much time do I have? I did not look at the time before I started speaking.
I think you have about 5-7 minutes left.
5-7 minutes, great. So I guess this is what I want to say. Madame Nielsen embodies the paradox at the core of the act of settlement, a paradox in which one's very attachment to the territory, and maybe I should pause here and say, when I talk about the paradox at the act of settlement here, with foregrounding Nielsen rather than Rice, whom I'm leaving aside for now. But throughout the vast majority of the book, I'm thinking primarily on those among the settlers who at least see themselves perhaps indeed are more liberal, more progressive, peace-seeking, whatever. So not explicitly racial and violent people. So in this paradox, I guess, one's very attachment to the territory, one's networks of belonging and identity also threatens the very attachments, networks, and identity that constitute them. Similar to Berlin's school optimism, what one desires, let's call it home, who one is what undoes or even destroys her, and destroys so many others. And I think that between Weiss and Nielsen, we see these different modes of destruction. For me, she captures so well what Albert Memmi referred to when he talked about the impossibility of the colonizer who refuses. The colonizer who refuses being a colonizer, or the colonizer who refuses the structure of colonization, which Memmi argues is an impossible position once we enter the structure of colonization. Maybe I'll just say this, because I don't like long Zoom talks. I'm always asked at the end of talks about this, talks that I give about this book, what kind of solution I advocate. What is the end game of that? What political reality I want to see unfolding? Especially if I said before, right, that the thing that I cannot call to or cannot but want, and yet I don't see, not in the figure of Madame Nielsen, but also wider in the book, not in the political reality in Israel-Palestine at the moment, I don't see any materials that allow me to concretize these like desired fantasies of a political horizon. So what is it that I see as a solution? And I have to admit, I have no good answer to this. So I'm already preempting this question. Sorry, it's just got really noisy here. So I'll end soon. But perhaps I can say this. If subjects emerge via the social conditions to which they are born and which continue to form them as they continue living, then we should at least entertain the possibility that the socio-political conditions of settlements are likely to give rise to some modes of attachment to violence. And basically, what the book tries is to map, right, these forms of attachment. And yet between Weiss, and yet even though this is a structural claim, right, a structural claim about the very conditions of and the very necessary outcomes of the condition of settler colonialism, between Weiss and Nielsen, we see very different articulations of these modes of attachment. And perhaps, just perhaps, someone there in between them, we can find a certain path for a political solution. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hagar, for this very important talk on the persistent investment in violent orders that constitute and sustain modes of life and identities and communities. So now, Rodrigo.
Well, thank you again, Paula. It's a pleasure again to be with you here today, and with the people I didn't get to meet yesterday, Hagar, Yannis, Samo, and the other speakers at this event. My presentation today complements the provocation that I made in yesterday's opening panel, in the sense that in both, my concern is with the same paradox that I think we can find at the heart of the resurgence of the far right in recent years. Namely, the fact that the far right, and obviously I'll be thinking and talking about Bolsonaro and Bolsonarismo in particular. So the fact that the far right manages to tap into anti-systemic sentiments by going much farther than most mainstream politics in acknowledging how bad things are for most people today, while at the same time channeling attention away from systemic causes and in the direction of scapegoating various minority groups, or even delirious conspiracy theories like QAnon. So in other words, what I'm interested in is the paradox of far-right politics as a very conformist type of revolt, or we could call it an anti-systemic politics for people who don't really believe the system could change in any major way. A politics that ultimately fights for a future that is very much or essentially like today, but which would somehow yield better results for those who feel left out by things as they are now. Yesterday, I suggested an answer to this paradox around the relationship between disavowal, namely disavowal of the state of the world and particularly of climate change, and denialist narratives, denialist of climate change, of COVID, etc., like those narratives that are peddled by the far right. The argument was basically that the stories that the far right tells at once offer people the recognition of their suffering and struggles and respond to a psychological need not to fully acknowledge how big the problems we face are and how much it would take to really address them. In that sense, the fact that these stories, that many of these stories or all of these stories are far-fetched or even absurd could be considered even an advantage. In the sense that within the far right taps into the atmospheric dread of a world with diminishing horizons by recognizing that, yes, we are facing an abyss, but do that by fabulating an abyss that is less dramatic than the one we actually face, since its causes and its fixes, though painful, are comparatively simple compared to obviously the real problems, the real causes, and the real fixes that it would take to deal with those. So what I'd like to do today is to address another side of this puzzle and ask, why is it that even as they recognize there is something profoundly wrong with the world today, many people can only imagine the solution as being more of the same? More capitalism, more competition, more meritocracy. What is the source of this cruel optimism, to borrow Lauren Delon's phrase and an idea that Hagar has already used, that keeps them demanding more of the same stuff that harms them? What I'd like to suggest is that there is something else at work here that is relevant to a discussion on the relation between affects and politics in two ways. First, in drawing attention to habituation as one of the key dimensions in which affects intervene in politics. Quite often, we tend to think of affects as intervening in politics only in moments of upheaval, when multitudes are suddenly moved to action either by the imitation of a leader or the imitation of one another. But these moments and these movements exist against the background of what Frédéric Lourdon has called a universal passional servitude that cements people's consent. Obviously, that word must, if this is how we frame it, that word must be then put between scare quotes. But a universal passional servitude that cements people's consent to the status quo through the force of habit. In other words, institutions like, say, wage labor produce a certain regularity of experience, which in turn produces certain affects, and through that, certain effective investments, which in turn make us invested in the continuity of the institutions that caused those investments in the first place. Habit has a circular structure, and affect is what makes its wheel go round. On the other hand, and this is the second point of the two that I just mentioned, that the second of the 2 points that I think this question, this puzzle helps us pose, is we must take care not to imagine these habit-producing affects as brute facts or raw data that would speak for themselves. They are always already caught in discourses that seek to give them meaning, to grant or to deny them recognition, and to provide them with justification. In other words, passional servitude is the habituation that results from our repeated affection, not only by certain experiences, like going to work or being evaluated or being punished by not making oneself available all the time, etc., but also by the discourses that arrange and associate those experiences in our mind. This element of habit, I believe, helps us explain the other side of the fascism as conformist revolt puzzle that I just raised. What I have in mind here, for example, is the habit and the discipline produced by such mechanisms as job insecurity, the rollback of the social safety net, private debt, precarization, Uberization, and so on. But also the habit produced by what is perhaps the neoliberal disciplinary mechanism par excellence, which is crisis itself. Every time a new crisis explodes, neoliberalism can not only use that crisis to accentuate the economic coercion to which people are subject, but it does so by reactivating its founding myth from the 70s and from the 1970s and 1980s of being the rational, technocratic cure for the excesses of the previous period, and therefore the only possible alternative. Obviously, in the 70s, the excesses of the previous period would be the labor militancy and the expansion of the welfare state in the 70s. But we can see that taken to comic proportions, for example, more recently, an example that Yannis will be very familiar with, the way in which the Greek debt crisis of the last decade, in the Greek debt crisis, the debt from private banks that the EU forced the Greek government to take on was then blamed on Greece's Mediterranean joie de vivre and profligacy, and the fact that they spent all their time in squares drinking coffee and eating things with olive oil. But I'm also thinking here of the phenomenon that the Argentinian sociologist Verónica Gago has described as neoliberalism from below, i.e. the ambivalent dynamic through which individuals engage in inventing strategies of survival in an environment reconfigured by neoliberal policies, come to understand themselves according to what she calls the logic of the micro-entrepreneur. The thing is, habit has the power to shape not only, and this is the hinge in the argument. The thing is that habit has the power to shape not only how everyday experience affects us, but the horizon of what we understand as possible. This is why people might continue to respond to calls coming from their government to tighten their belts, even when instead of a means to a better life, those calls increasingly appear, and tightening one's belt increasingly appears as an end in itself, as the naked imperative to adapt continuously to ever worse conditions. This is also why Bolsonaro could literally say during the pandemic, without that having, at least at first, any cost for him in terms of popularity, that the poor would have to choose between protecting their lives or protecting their income. Since inequality made it impossible for them, for the poor in Brazil to go on quarantine, many people heard this and thought, yes, that's objectively true. In fact, it showed that Bolsonaro was more in touch with their reality than any of the hypocritical lefties telling them to stay at home when they had no option but to go to work. Bolsonaro's discourse worked precisely because it played on the force of habit. It was because people could not even imagine other alternatives, a more substantial and lasting basic income program, support for businesses to continue to pay wages during shutdown, a freeze on rents and evictions, and so on. Because people could not even imagine those alternatives, that Bolsonaro could credibly claim that the economy or your life was the only choice available. And in doing so, and getting away with it, he achieved exactly what he wanted, which was to make sure those alternatives remained hidden from view and away from public debate. I believe that this provides us with an insight both into the phenomenon of what people have taken to calling Bolsonarismo popular, popular Bolsonarismo, i.e. the lower class support for Bolsonaro, but also an insight into the peculiar nature of Bolsonarismo, as well as other successful far-right projects around the world in recent years. Which peculiar nature am I referring to? Namely, the fact that these projects, Bolsonarismo and other far-right projects, are cross-class alliances that bring together some of those who would have the most to gain from a radical transformation of society and those who are fighting to protect their own privileges. Brings together those sectors that have few material concerns but resent the advances made by some other marginalized groups, and those that are haunted by falling standards and the prospect of no longer enjoying rights that they once had. Their capacity to bring together neoliberalism from above and neoliberalism from below, the capacity to bring together, as Bolsonarismo does, social conservatism, authoritarianism, extreme market libertarianism, and, surprisingly, hope. In part, of course, this alchemy depends on what has been the far-right's quintessential conjuring trick everywhere, which is promoting precisely the confusion between anxiety around the loss of rights and the fear of losing privileges. The fact that in the last decade, severe losses for many people coincided with modest gains made by some marginalized groups is what helps the far right convince the losers of neoliberalism that if they are being deprived of rights, it is because others, women, migrants, ethnic groups, LGBTQ people, etc., are gaining privileges off their backs. But the affects nurtured by neoliberalism and the discourses that give it meaning are also important for the far right to the extent that they share with social conservatism and authoritarianism a moral grammar that is built around the elements of individualism, punitivism, and the valorization of order above the law. And this is what my conclusion is going to be on. Not now, in a second. Ideas like self-reliance and becoming an entrepreneur of oneself are, of course, among the highest values posited by neoliberal discourse. But in a world reconfigured by these ideas, they are also essential to the strategies of survival required to navigate relationships, institutions, and work, and are integral to how individuals perceive themselves. People have no option but to internalize the idea that they are solely responsible for their own fate. By rendering invisible both the interdependencies that sustain individual trajectories and the structural constraints that hold them back, the individualistic grammar of neoliberalism voids the notion of a social space beyond the immediate private sphere. There are only individuals, and at best, their families, as someone famously said. That's someone, in case some people missed the joke, was Margaret Thatcher. This not only deprives people of the language in which to address structural injustice, it induces them to interpret positive changes in their economic environment as their own achievement, while at the same time making them see the structural demands made by others, say by Black or Indigenous people, as requests for special treatment, as a form of special pleading. Thus, the suffering that one has to go through in life, the impossibility of living up to the ideal of extreme individualism when structural conditions all play against us, all of that is turned outwards as resentment and negative solidarity. If I had to battle through life alone, then everyone else should too. And I'm actually drawing this quote from Jennifer Silver's book, Coming Up Short, which is a perfect portrait of what I am describing here. This produces a punitive animus that is highly respectful of established authority, social roles, and divisions, in which organized crime and social movements are potentially equally repugnant and despised. Among the rich as well as the poor, this punitivism tends to be directed at those at the base of the social pyramid more than those at the top. When those at the bottom of the pyramid commit crimes or organize politically, they are perceived as trying to take a shortcut or seeking advantages that others don't have. The transgressions of those at the top, on the other hand, if morally questionable, are seen as their reward for having made it in life. And this then is where individualism and punitivism intersect with the notion of order as something above and ultimately against the law, which is obviously characteristic of authoritarianism. This placing of order above the law is, I believe, a universal tendency that has been intensified by neoliberalism. But it's also a very entrenched characteristic of Brazilian culture on which Bolsonarismo finds plenty of support. Even after the abolition of slavery, which Brazil was one of the last countries in the world to enact, the permanent and assured exercise of one's rights was a privilege reserved exclusively to those of a certain social standing. Punishment, on the other hand, was certain only for those whose status did not exempt them from observing the same rules as everyone else. In a society in which the guarantee of equality before the law is a privilege, the demand for order is thus usually not about applying the law, but about revoking the rights of those who do not deserve them, who do not deserve rights, and granting special treatment to those who do. I think this is very visible in four themes that are very dear to Bolsonarismo: the call for human rights for the right humans, direitos humanos para humanos direitos, so no human rights for criminals or for those who are judged to be criminals, the flexibilization of gun laws, which amounts to privatizing the sovereign power over death, the dismantling of environmental protections, which are understood as obstacles to entrepreneurship, and the crusade against speed cameras and traffic fines, which are seen as impinging on car owners' liberty. So on the one hand, and now I arrive at the conclusion, on the one hand, the pre-modern logic that places the right to flaunt common rules as the greatest right of all fits in well with the neoliberal absolutization of individual freedom, which again we find during the pandemic in discourses which were taken up very eagerly by Bolsonaro and his entourage, such as "no one can make me wear a mask" or "no one can force me to take the vaccine." On the other hand, as this type of order supposes not the formal equality of laws, but the arbitrary exercise of authority, It combines perfectly with the defense of the traditional distribution of roles between men and women, white and non-white, straight and non-straight, etc., and thus also with the traditional structures of an extremely, or the status quo of an extremely unequal society. It's this confluence of the pre and the postmodern, of traditional authority and the neoliberal voiding of the social, I think, that creates the basis on which the ruling elite and the excluded can meet. It's a meeting between those who have given up on waiting for the democratizing promises of modernity and those who are no longer even nominally interested in pursuing those promises, or the meeting between those who have ceased to expect accountability and equality and those who are unwilling to make concessions to such values. So it is, to conclude, in this sense, that we can say, as Adorno once said of fascism, that Bolsonarismo and so many of the other far-right, resurgent far-right movements that we see today are the scars of a democracy that has failed to live up to its concept, or a democracy whose promises were never delivered in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for such a rich talk and for providing us with a way of understanding the appeal of Bolsonaro to the lower classes and also the appeal of the far right in general, among many other things. So now the floor is yours, Yannis.
Thank you very much. It is great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I will speak about something slightly different, but very much related to the first two talks, because I'll try to relate nationalism with populism and see, or rather the opposite, try to see how they can be differentiated from each other. And then we can think about their articulation in many examples, empirical examples. So this will relate with the first paper to a certain extent, but also to this blend between popular and elitist elements in Rodrigo's paper. I have a short PowerPoint, and maybe I can share it with you. Okay, yes. Is it okay? Can you see it? Good. Okay, so this is the topic to a certain extent. Relationship between populism and nationalism. These are obviously two interpellations. People talk about them and invite other people to accept and identify, and also the loop involves identification from the other side. So it's supply and demand, as we would say in traditional political science. I will try to speak about that. Obviously, collective politics presupposes the mobilization and activation of affective energies, as we have already heard, and they're channeling towards particular discursive ensembles and meaning constructions. And although the mechanisms are very similar here, interpellation, identification, supply, demand, whatever you want to call it, habit, whatever, the architectonics involved and the orientations, the political orientations can be slightly different. They can be multiple, and they can lead to very difficult, different political outcomes. So I think it is important to try to have a clear picture of what is involved, especially in this area where populism and nationalism become disentangled very, very often. So this is my basic idea. I will draw on, actually it's not only a paper, it's a series of papers we have published with my colleague Benjamin Declin from Brussels. And these papers draw on the work by Laclau and Mouffe. And the basic idea is what I have already mentioned, to try to identify and make clear what really populism seems to be, what nationalism is, whether we can distinguish them from each other. And in fact, the basic hypothesis is that we can make maybe at the discursive level, I'm not have time to go into very much into what happens when people start identifying with them, when politicians start blending them. I will try to show that in the first instance, at the conceptual level, the discursive level, you can have two different things called the one nationalist, the other populist. And then, of course, that makes it possible and makes it easier for us to understand what exactly happens when people, either politicians or voters or citizens, blend them together. And I think there are many criteria that follow from a discursive approach from the so-called Esse school that can help us differentiate between populism and nationalism. How exactly the signifier, the master signifier, the nodal point, the empty signifier, the people, is conceptualized exactly, whether it is reduced to we heard about the territory, is it reduced to some sort of territorial conceptualization of the nation, of blood, of who knows, we'll see about that, or is it something else? And that would distinguish populism from nationalism, populism proper from nationalism. Or if you want left-wing what is often called left-wing populism or inclusionary populism from exclusionary populism or extreme right-wing populism. These concepts are used interchangeably in the literature. And also try to see what is the orientation involved in each case. Is it a horizontal orientation along ethnic lines, or is it a very predominantly vertical orientation, bottom up, which is would involve a more egalitarian or more progressive, if you want, schema. So I think distinguishing along these lines of what we could call populism proper and then nationalism or left-wing populism and right-wing populism is very helpful, because usually we deal with hybrids, we deal with national populist projects, we deal with things which seem with political projects that seem very confusing and very difficult to analyze, and it is always helpful at the conceptual level to try to see the different logics and the different rhetorical and also affective patterns involved. Of course, I will draw on, I will try to present an alternative theorization to what is usually being discussed as populism. Of course, populism today is being discussed by everybody. If you read the paper in the newspaper or hear a talk show, whatever, populism is bound to appear at some point. But it is, of course, presented usually as some sort of disease, some sort of anomaly that contaminates an otherwise healthy body of an idealized liberal democracy. And I think that, and what is very paradoxical is that also, because I can understand, of course, the political stakes here, it is quite okay, we can understand them, but also academic discourse has adopted in most cases this very pejorative understanding of populism. And what is often missed here is the long genealogy of populist phenomena going back to the 19th century in the United States and Russia. So in Russia, we had revolutionary populism, and Marx was very much interested towards the end of his life, letter to Vera Zasulich, a lot of things we could mention here, and also the People's Party in the US, and the whole genealogy that followed. This is mostly ignored by the discussion today, and also a rather complex relationship towards nationalism, democracy, and representation that is not very discussed, not very much discussed around us. And you see here, this was an inspiration for me, quote by Comer van Woodward, a very important American historian who points out that with regards to populism, usually we have a lot of condescension, arrogance, and ignorance on the part of the elites and of academics as well. So let's see how we can move beyond that. And okay, this is a standard list of what is really missing sometimes in populist literature. The history of the concept, the history of the phenomenon, the history of the concept as well, because there is a long history of theorizations of populism, going back to Hicks in the 1930s, to Margaret Canavan, to the 60s, all sorts of things that are not really discussed very much. The importance of global comparison, methodological rigor. There are today new ethnographic approaches, there are discursive approaches, there are historical approaches, the approaches based on E.P. Thompson's moral economy, you know, whatever. There's very important work which is being done, which is never discussed, basically. So we have to go to all that to approach all this multiplicity in order to arrive at a more comprehensive and more rigorous understanding of populism. And my orientation draws on Laclau and Mouffe's theory of hegemony, which is both linguistic. Of course, it focuses on discourse, but discourse does not mean language. It is both linguistic and materialist. Discursive practices are basically studied, which are not reducible to ideas. All practices that create meaning, we have heard a lot about that up until now. Of course, all that happens within a horizon of social negativity. It's a Sisyphean struggle to create new meanings and to create meanings with which people will identify and create hegemonic orders, but this is always done against the background of negativity, failure, dislocation, and so on and so forth. I'm not going into much detail in that. Laclau's approach, of course, is also formal. It does not have to do, it tries to bracket, at least in the first instance, ideological content and focus on the particular patterning, on the particular framing of populist or nationalist or other discourses. And we will see how this can help us in drawing certain meaningful distinctions. So it's also special. It's a special approach. This, I would not reduce this to territorial, because space could also be a topological space, for example. But so it's a little bit complex, but we will see where this leads. And these are some of the questions we could ask by focusing on this particular direction. I will go a little bit quickly because the juice is towards the end. It also involves affective processes. It focuses on this architectonics of discourse, the creation of meaningful scenario and narratives, political narratives, interpellation using these narratives, identification processes. But this all is not purely discursive, it's also affective. And Laclau saw affect as being co-substantial with discourse. And it's also performative, because we heard Judith Butler also mentioned here. Laclau points out explicitly that this is also a performative approach. And to a certain extent, performative here means that the people is produced out of it. The people is not there in the beginning. What you have in the beginning, you have a plurality of demands, and then you have the process of equivalential, you have equivalences which are created, and then through this process, and then this is effectively invested and accepted and so on and so forth. And through this process, a new collective political subject is produced, which is the people. So this is a performative dynamic approach. I want to talk a little bit about minimal criteria. And first I want to say something about criteria to distinguish populism from populist from non-populist discourse. I will focus on discourse, obviously, and then I will move on to discuss the kernel of my presentation, which is criteria to distinguish left-wing from right-wing populism or populism from nationalism. Okay. There are two criteria, and here there is a consensus between, or gradually a consensus is emerging in populism research between discursive and other approaches, although other approaches also add some other criteria as well. So the two main questions that one needs to ask according to this approach in order to determine whether we have to do the populist discourse or not is whether it is antagonistic, whether it is dichotomic. So is it a discourse that is very technocratic, doesn't really accept social antagonism, political antagonism, or is it a discourse that posits some sort of dichotomy? And then, so dichotomies like that are dichotomies between the marginalized and the establishment, the underdog and the 1%, the 99%, the 1%, and so on and so forth. So do we have a discourse which posits such a strong antagonism? Does it involve polarization, in other words? This is the one criterion. This draws on Saussures' distinction between a paradigmatic and synagmatic axis. And the second criterion is, as long as you have this antagonistic dichotomic discourse, do you prioritize the popular side? So this dichotomy is between the popular side and another side, the establishment side, the underdog and the elite. Do you prioritize the first or the second? If you prioritize the people, then maybe you are populist. Okay, so we have these two minimal criteria in order to determine whether a particular discourse is populist or not. But that does not really help us when we can, in cases where we have discourses that are dichotomic, they refer to the people, but they might be left-wing or right-wing, they might refer to the nation or not, and so on and so forth. So we need something else, we need something extra in order to make sure that we can also distinguish between populism and nationalism, or left-wing populism and right-wing populism, or inclusionary populism and exclusionary populism, which is a distinction introduced by Mude and Kaltwasser. So, okay, this is a conclusion about the two criteria: people-centrism and anti-elitism. Okay, I have already mentioned this, and this can also, it's not a purely political, it is predominantly political distinction, but it can also have sociocultural implications. This has been thematized by Pierre Ostegui and others. So okay, this is also something that I have forgotten about the slide. We also have to see this whole antagonistic scenario within, I mean, this also involves anti-populists. It's not only populists that try to resolve a crisis or try to put forward something new. There are also anti-populists that do that, and you have a hegemonic struggle, and then populism can turn out to be victorious or not, depending on the particular case. So I think now my next slide is, yes, okay. So if we want to construct a certain typology along the lines I have suggested, we have two criteria. We can introduce two more criteria to a certain extent. So the first criterion would be the orientation of the, so we said in order to be populist, you have to be antagonistic. But the antagonism involved in a particular discourse, what is exactly its orientation? Is it vertical or is it horizontal? So if it is vertical, if it prioritizes an up-down, high-low dichotomy, if it is upward punching, you know, the elite is always up there, then the chances are that you have to do with left-wing, inclusionary, or populist proper discourse. If the antagonism, if the orientation of the antagonism is horizontal, constructed along ethnic lines or similar in-group, out-group, you know, something like that. And if it is downward punching towards immigrants, for example, you know, we are poor, we have been impoverished, we suffer, but who is to blame? It's not the people up there, but it is the immigrants, or maybe both, because you also have hybrids that try to combine the two. And this other, which is punched in this downward punching, is depicted as a cultural or ethnic outsider who is to blame for our predicament. So in this case, you would have extreme right or right-wing populism, or you would have a passage towards a more nationalist conditioning of this particular discourse. The second criterion is whether the nodal point, the master signifier, the people, which we have accepted in what we have been discussing previously as the point of reference in populism, if these people about whom we are talking about, what exactly is it? Is it what Laclau would call an empty signifier? Is it just a narrative invocation that interpellates almost everybody to be incorporated? Okay, because we had populist examples like that. Almost everybody. I remember Andreas Papandreou from Greece. I was a child at that time, and I remember him. Almost everybody, unless you belong to this 1%, could be part of the people. Or Syriza in the last few years. If you were an immigrant, you could be part of the people. If you were a woman, part of the people. If you were youth, a part of the people. A small entrepreneur, part of the people. You know, this. And in Latin America, this is very common as well. So the people function as an empty signifier. If you go to extreme right-wing populism or to cases in which nationalism is at the core and some populist elements are at the periphery, then when you ask this, if you ask, oh, okay, you have people who are using this signifier, the people popular and so on, popular demands, and so forth. But if you ask them, who are these people you are talking about? They will not tell you, everybody, just come and be a part of these people. They will not tell you that. They will say only those who have this particular type of blood or who refer to the nation or have this ethnic belonging necessarily can belong to these people. Everybody else is excluded. So you have an exclusionary notion. You have a transcendental, mythical, transcendental signified. So in the first case, you have an empty signifier, and then maybe it seems that you have populism. If you have a transcendental, mythical signified, which is posited as a very strong reference, then the chances are that you have right-wing populism or some sort of reduction to nationalist narrative construction. So this is a graphic illustration of what I have been talking about. You can find that in some of our papers with Benjamin Declean, the formal criterion, what I have been talking about up to now. What is the nodal point? The nation, the people, the nation, or the people as nation, the people as a signifier that, however, refers to a particular signifier, transcendental signified in this case, or the people as underdog, as an empty signifier, subject position offered, the outside non-members of other nations, the elite in the left-wing case, and the orientation of the particular antagonism, horizontal or vertical. So this encapsulates most of what I have been talking about. It is available in some of these publications, and the implication is that, and I think this is somehow relevant to the broader discussion on populism, both in the media and in academia. What is often discussed as extreme right-wing or exclusionary populism, and sometimes, because you have this horseshoe theory, sometimes it is used to discredit egalitarian political projects as well, because this must be populist as well. But in most cases, sometimes people want to say, no, because the left is not populist. It's only to the right. But this ignores the whole canon of populist mobilizations throughout history in the last 200 years. In effect, I would argue the other way around. I would say that the populist canon is left-wing or egalitarian or inclusionary. And then you have this mostly European, Eurocentric peculiarity of far-right populism, which has been used in order to shift the whole area of populism research in recent years. In my view, and with this I will be concluding my talk, what is usually discussed and debated as extreme right-wing or exclusionary populism is in effect very often a nationalist xenophobic ideology, and the people plays only a peripheral and secondary role here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yannis, for sharing with us your rigorous study of populism and of this distinction between populism and nationalism. It's a pleasure to hear you speak after reading your books for so many years.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we have some questions already. We have already 3 questions for Hagar and 1 for Rodrigo. So I think I'm going to pose this 2 sets of questions now, and then we go for another round. Okay, so let me just get them here. So to Hagar, if you don't mind, I think I'll pose the 3 of them. Yes. From Bruno, his question is, considering that the territory is an important aspect to our very political order at the moment, do you think it's possible to create a powerful emotional attachment without relying in this, on the territorial dimensions? If so, how? So this is the first question. The second question is by Nina. She describes her experience. She says, I was in a gathering of volunteers as the only Black person and surrounded by a group of white women in Lisbon. When asked why they wanted to do voluntary work in Mozambique, they all said, because it's my dream to die there. But part just were born there, not even raised, and the other part never set foot in the continent. I found the answers pathological. 90% didn't have voluntary work experience anywhere, and they were between 30 and 50 years old. Is this a type of denial or another type of denial? And is it extremely violent or dangerous? And she ends by saying that her application was rejected and she was the only person with experience and an adequate CV. And the final question to you right now, Hagar, is by João. He asks, in which sense does the settler's identity threaten her own identification process? Is it a consequence of this process being a phantasmatic project, an impossible possibility, and so on? The core of this paradoxical relationship wasn't clear to me. Was the question clear to you? Okay, so I'm just going to ask a question to Rodrigo that was sent to me in private, so it wasn't there on the chat for everybody to see. It's by Carolina. Rodrigo, how would you articulate or merge your 2018 concept of social antagonism, which would be fomented by the far right, with this binomial of regularity and rationality you just described through habits? And I asked her to clarify a little bit, and she said the regularity is what you use to characterize these habits, the regular habits, and rationality to characterize the practices that materialize these habits. Okay, can go ahead, Rodrigo.
Can you, sorry, Paula, could you just repeat that last bit?
Yes, she wrote that she understood that you said that regularity is the term you use to characterize habits, and rationality that you use to characterize the practices that materialize these habits. Okay, so maybe Hagar can begin, and then Rodrigo, and I'll collect some more questions.
Great, thank you. And these are really, really excellent questions. And I want to start with Juan's question about the paradox, because I think it gives me an opportunity to address something I think I failed to do in my presentation. Basically, I thought I'm coming to speak to people who read my paper, and then I found myself with 300 people and some more on YouTube, which made me, I think, run very quickly between the very, very grand scheme and the very, very smallest of details without proper mediation. So I think I will take this opportunity to think about this paradox in order to do some of this mediation. But I think we must begin my answer with acknowledging that this question, which is also my question, right? So it's about me, not just about the question. This question about the self-threat, right? The threat to the self who is the settler is already a marginal and must remain a marginal question. The question what we need to ask is about the threat to the native. It's not what's important politically is not what happens to the settler in this order of things. Now, it's nevertheless important to ask the question about what happens to the settler, because I think it would be highly unlikely, and if possible, then probably problematic, to engage at this particular moment of time, in this particular context, it's not a general claim, to engage in radical processes of decolonization without taking into account also the positionality of the settler. So the question about the positionality of the settler is a derivative, right, of the question of decolonization, which is a question that must emerge because what we care about when we think about the threats around are the threats for the life and livelihood and well-being of the native. So having said that, let me nevertheless engage with the question of that paradox. And I guess what I try to capture through the concept of Madame Nielsen is a paradox that tries to insert itself into a particular debate within critical thinking about violence. So when we think about violence as a political order, we tend to think about it in many different ways. And when we think of populism, we would think of one way. When we think about what make people adhere to orders that hurt them, such as capitalism, we would think about another set of explanations. In this sense, the other two talks really complement this. But when we think about what has begun to receive the name perpetrator studies, for example, we often think critically, right, about the violence of which people engage. And we sometimes think of these people, especially when we think about democratic contexts, we often think of maybe not often, but the type of thinking I am most interested in is the type of thinking about the violence of people that perceive themselves as liberal, democratic, progressive, whatever, right? That belong to the left and definitely do not belong to the far fascist right, because then I think another set of explanation is at place. Now, often critical thought, critical political thought, tries to interject itself into that question of violence by bringing to the surface the order of violence in order to create some, what I call a crisis in identity in the settler, in the violent person, in the colonizer, in the perpetrator, whatever. The assumption is that if people are indeed, right, liberal, democratic, blah, 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 progressive, leftist, when they will understand what is at stake in the political orders they support and perpetuate, they would simply stop doing that, right? Because they are indeed leftist and progressive and liberal and blah, 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 blah. And what I try to say, and this is the paradox that emerges, is that it doesn't work, right? And I think Rodrigo's concept of the idea of of the habitus is really important here in this regard. People are attached so much to the order and to the positions they inhabit that sometimes they would prefer to reaffirm these orders even when they understand the violent stakes, rather than completely undoing them. And at this moment emerges the paradox. And this is the paradox I try to kind of give you a taste of when I talked about Madame Nielsen, someone who is indeed quite progressive and liberal, and indeed came to the colony maybe not even as a settler, but cannot but self-annul herself constantly in order to continue be who she is, that is both liberal, whatever, and a person living in the colony. So it's the incarnations of these paradoxes, I guess, that I'm interested in, and how to then unpick or unpack them in order to undo this order of attachment, which brings me to Bruno's question in a way, about how can we think about attachments differently. Now, I think the first thing we need to recognize in this regard is that the attachment to territory is very important to the subject position of the settler as a settler, and maybe also the subject position of the landowner as a landowner, right? If we're thinking about the order of capitalism and not settler colonialism. But it's not important to any and each facets within ourselves. And in this regard, subject position is itself an artifact or a fracture. We are never just one thing. We are an assemblages of subject positions in a way, and they don't always live well with each other, which gets me back to the paradoxical existence. So I think we're often attached to other things. We have other forms of attachment, not to territory. I think each and every one of us can individually think of many of them. And so my question, or the point of interventions that I try to make, is what happens, right, when these attachments, when these particular forms of attachment to territory, right, create this order of violence, which is not to say we cannot have other forms of attachment or that these are necessary. And I think the first thing that we need to do if we want to think decolonization, which is where I would want to go eventually, is first of all to recognize them, not to try to immediately replace them, which is what I insinuated to when I talked about these orders of substitutions in both capitalism and settler colonialism. This replacement is not always possible, or if it's possible, it's a very long process that needs to be accounted for. So we need to recognize them, and I guess this is why I begin with the concept of home, right? To argue that the settlement is the home of both the native and the settler at one and the same time. And that these attachments, even if they are violent attachments, even if they generate further violence, must be contended with. And that any challenge to this order must also be a challenge to this order of attachment. So that we must work in an effectual level, which again brings me back maybe to the subject of this conference, right? Any international change in this regard, if we think right through this perspective, must be always also, or maybe first and foremost, or first of all, before we start to do anything else, an effectual change in these modes of attachment. And I guess rather than maybe Bruno's reversal of replacement attachment to a territory with an attachment to something else, maybe what I would want to advocate is an attachment to a territory that somehow, I don't want to say bypasses or annuls, because I'm not sure it's completely possible, but that somehow mitigates or moderates or makes less or becomes less, in a way, a violent attachment. So can we imagine another attachment to territory, even to the territory of the colony, that takes a different form. And again, I think Madame Nielsen as a metaphor, as a phantasmatic order, gives us a way of thinking about it. If we think about her death, not as an actual death, a physical death, but as a certain radical change in identity, in positionality, etc. I feel I've been talking too much, so maybe to the last question, I would just say that I guess to answer it properly, we need like proper fieldwork with these people to understand better what are the kind of motivations and what's at stake. I feel very incapable of judging or addressing based on this bit of information.
Thank you, Hagar. Fascinating. Rodrigo?
Just noticed that, just a second, because I noticed that Carolina has sent me a message now explaining the question. Right. Well, I'll include Michael's question on the chat as well in my answer. So so how to associate the idea of social antagonism, and Carolina asked me about something I wrote in 2018, and I had to Google the word social antagonism in my name to try and find out what she was talking about, because I couldn't for the life of me remember what it was. It's how to reconcile this idea of habit and regularity with social antagonism. And I think the key word here is precisely a word that I think Carolina introduced. I don't remember saying it myself, but it's exactly the right word, which is regularity. Regularity is a word that connects this discussion to the statistical revolution in science in the 19th century. So when we're talking, and it conveys precisely the sense that when we're talking about habit, we're talking about regularity rather than necessity. So we're talking about the reproduction of habit as the reproduction of statistically more likely behaviors, statistically more likely affects, statistically more likely ideas, which doesn't mean that other ideas, that opposite ideas, that ideas that escape that escape the reproduction of those affects, of those practices, of those institutions, of those ideas, aren't present. They are there. They are there all the time, and we could understand this in effective terms. For example, through Spinoza's idea of fluctuatio animi, of the fact that we're torn between different affects that we have surrounding the same thing. So we feel the hurt that Hagar is talking about. That feeling is there. That feeling hurts us. Occasionally it overpowers us, but statistically, the pool of social reproduction is stronger. We stay attached, even though we feel that attachment hurting us. We feel that attachment is harmful. And quite often, and here I include Michael's question, quite often these other feelings, these other sentiments, these other directions in which people's affects point are beaten out of people in a very literal sense. And I totally agree with the point that Michael makes, that we must make a distinction between not being capable of imagining alternatives at all. For example, in the case of the pandemic, being unable to imagine a basic social income. And on the other hand, being able to imagine that things could be different, but not being able to imagine those things actually happening. So in Kafka's phrase, knowing that there is hope, just not for us, knowing that things could be different, but actually not believing that we could make them different. And one of the ways in which the second feeling is literally beaten into people is in Brazil, is precisely the case of casual everyday police violence that Michael raises. The important thing is that there is no opposition between talking about affect and habit and this. Something like regular casual police violence is also a form of habituation, is also a way of producing habit, of producing certain affects that tend towards social reproduction. But then again, these other feelings, these other sentiments, these other affects, these other ideas, they are there, and sometimes they can come out as social antagonism in ways, and I think this is the point at which theory sometimes fails us, or not us, the people who do theory. Theory sometimes fails people, or the people, if we're being populist, in the sense that we tend to imagine the ways in which these antagonism finally manages to come out, to escape the pool of reproduction, as being magic. And however fast these transformations might happen, they're never simply magic. And it's precisely the capacity to organize these affects, the capacity to organize these shifts in social mood that overcomes the thing that Michael was pointing out, i.e. that overcomes the fact that people might sometimes imagine that things could be different, but they don't imagine that they could actually make them different. So this is, for me personally, this is why the question of political organization is a central question, because it is precisely the question that bridges the gap between these two different subjective positions, or these three different subjective positions: not being able to imagine that things could be different, being able to imagine that things could be different, but not imagining that we could make them different, and actually trying to make them different, and actually acting collectively together in order to make them different. Hopefully that answers the question. Who knows what I was talking about in 2018? Basically, that's the short answer.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And Rodrigo was mentioning organization being so important. As I read, his book just came out this year, and I understand it will be translated to Portuguese, right, Rodrigo? So we can expect that soon. Okay, so we have...
Hopefully this year.
This year already? Great. Okay, so we have two questions to Yannis and another to Rodrigo and to Hagar. I'll read the four of them, so because we only have 15 minutes left, so I think it will be faster if I do it this way. So to Yannis, a question from Michael, which I will translate on the go, so I'm sorry if it doesn't come out right. he says, he asks, in the distinction between left populism and right-wing populism, you say that the first, left-wing populism is structured around an empty signifier, whereas the second, right-wing populism, is structured around a transcendental signifier, nation, race, etc. His question is, isn't there a more concrete question or issue there? The fact that some people, the poorest people, are in fact tied to the nation, either because they cannot leave the nation or because when they do leave, they are still associated to this nation, which has a series of consequences. The second question to you, Yannis, is by Bruno. He asks, do you think these traditional negative approaches towards populism are related to a liberal bias in populism studies? In other words, aren't scholars trying to say that the far right has nothing to do with the liberal, rational, correct way of doing politics? Okay, now a question to Rodrigo, which is also in Portuguese. I'll translate so the others can understand as well, although we do have translation. A lot has been said about hate when we talk about the far right, but that which affects us also, oh, how to translate convoca? Now I don't know. I won't try. So I ask you, I think I'll ask in Portuguese and let our translators do the hard work. I think that's clever. Rodrigo, muitos têm falado sobre o ódio ao se referir à extrema-direita, mas aquilo que nos afeta também nos convoca. Com isso, te pergunto, o desamparo não seria o fio condutor desse processo? No sentido que tais figuras como Bolsonaro supostamente oferecem amparo? Você tem abordado o desamparo em suas pesquisas? Muito obrigada pelos tradutores e desculpa por ter tentado traduzir quando claramente não é meu trabalho aqui. And finally, a question by Alice Maria to Hagar. In which ways can we think territory not as a space of conflict and divide, exclusion, of division and exclusionary politics, if we look at territory through a peace construction lenses?
Shall I start? Okay, thank you. There was also one about horseshoe theory, but it has been, I think it has been, somebody wrote a comment because somebody asked Joao, what is the horseshoe theory? And somebody replied that it is when the two political extremes, so-called extremes, seem to be seen as converging. They are seen as identical, and this is exactly what the horseshoe theory is. And it is one of the prime legitimizing stereotypes of centrist ideologies and consensus politics. Now, about the question by Michael, I think that this is correct. There is, and that's why I mentioned that I will be dealing with things at the purely conceptual level, because at the empirical level, you have all sorts of hybridic situations in which the two patterns overlap with each other, but that is not purely bad, let's say. It can also be positive to a certain extent, because you can also have populism becoming more nationalist and more mythical and more right-wing and so on and so forth. But you can also have nationalism becoming slightly different from what it is. So because there are nationalisms in the plural, you had anti-colonial national, you had all sorts of different types of nationalism around. But I think the question links very well with this concept by Michael Billig, banal nationalism, because the problem is that even if you are not a committed nationalist yourself, we live in nation states for the last 200-300 years. It's I mean, if you wanted to to meet a pure populist who would have no idea of you should go to Mars. There's nobody who can, or a true leftist who is, this thing does not exist, in fact. So we have to deal with these hybridic situations. And that's why I think that this conceptual approach can be fruitful, because you still have these differences, but then you have to see how exactly they link with each other. And linking can go towards the one direction or towards the other direction. It seems to me that definitely the left cannot really say, a position saying, I'm not interested in the nation, I don't care about that, it's a taboo concept, or about territory, or all these things may not be feasible. You definitely have to deal with them. You have to analyze them very carefully. And I think this panel has done a lot to disentangle very difficult connections there. And also you have to work politically on them. Just moving away and looking somewhere else will not really help very much. Now, the last question by Bruno, and that also what I said, because there is another question by Paula to Hagar and myself, which goes exactly towards this direction I have been talking about, but maybe Hagar can talk a little bit more about that. If I can go to Bruno's question, I absolutely agree. There is a liberal bias which is visible in most approaches to populism today. At least to the mainstream, there's a certain liberal orthodoxy in discussing populism, and we have constructed the genealogy of that. Maybe the founding moment it has to do with American populism, with populism in the US, because if you watch the historiography of American populism in the US by American historians, the idea during the first 50 years from the 1900 to 1950s is rather positive. This American populist is of the 1890s is a very progressive movement, egalitarian movement, which has influenced the Roosevelt, the New Deal, and so on and so forth. And then suddenly you have Richard Hofstadter, this very important liberal intellectual who somehow has some sort of animosity towards populism. He doesn't do any research on real populism, but he has this stereotype that this is a very conservative, very backward-looking movement, and he introduces a series of stereotypes, including this horseshoe view of the extreme left and the extreme right, and so he basically connects egalitarian populism with McCarthy somehow. He links this liberal view, this liberal attack on populism, to a very particular approach to modernization. Mind you, this is the era in which modernization theory is very important, but the American version is that you only have one modernization. It is a Tina dogma avant la lettre to a certain extent. There is only one modernization leading to capitalism and democracy, American style. And if you don't like that, and if you demonstrate, you must be paranoid, you must be bad populist, backward looking, whatever. So this is emerging there. It's a very liberal, anti-populist view. And then, although it is largely delegitimized in the US, especially after Vietnam and all that stuff, and this is important for us also, both for Brazil and for Greece or for Argentina, it migrates to the semi-periphery. So it migrates, for example, in Argentina, you have Gino Germani, the whole idea about populism, which is influenced by this thing. In Greece, you have the so-called cultural dualism thesis, which is constructed along these lines. I'm sure that in Brazil, you must have something similar. So yes, there is liberal bias, and it starts, I think, with Hofstadter and all the intellectual genealogy that followed. Thank you.
Rodrigo or Hagar, I don't know if you have any preference.
I can maybe continue with a question. Well, first about territory as a space of not of exclusion, but a space we can reshape, right, through peace construction. I think this is where we want to go, right? This is the vision, and this is what we need. I hope this is not contested or even contestable, but I guess the question is, A, is it possible? And second, under what conditions it is possible? And I guess this is precisely where Paula's question about the conversation between myself and Yannis, this is precisely what it touches on with this idea of the people as an empty signifier. Because Madame Nielsen's position, if we take her position as a position of a people as an empty signifier, says in a way precisely that, right? You are the people, like Yannis says, you are the people, you are the people, you are the people. Come on, we will all be together as a people. Doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter what you are, what you do. You can be black, you can be white, you can be settler, you can be colonized, you can be native, you can be rich and poor. We'll all be together as a people. This is great. Does it work? If we stay within the analogy, when Madame Nielsen invokes this empty signifier, when she says our country, she says it in order to summon her being killed. She can share the land, she can think about the country as ours only when she called Chembe to join the fighting forces and engage in an attack, at the end of which she dies. These are the conditions of sharing in this sense. Now it is up for us to decide we want to reject the analogy altogether and say, well, this is a play, we don't have to go along with it. Or to say, well, actually this play captures something that we find in other theories of decolonization, from Memmi to Fanon. This is the idea that we find, this idea that decolonization is about replacement, that it is impossible to engage in conditions of sharing after the radical modes of oppression have established themselves. And if we go back to the dual structure of capitalism, we can ask the same question. What would it mean under the radical inequality, in unequal conditions in which we inhabit our countries, to start suddenly sharing? Will the rich people just give up their houses and invite people in? Would they be willing to just like give up all the property to the state? Like what would be the conditions under which people would refuse their position to allow this peace process, either real peace process or metaphorical peace process to start? And I guess I don't know, and I have no solutions, but I guess the question is to go back to Madame Nielsen's, following Paula's invitation, would be to ask what are the, not just the certain contexts as Paula writes, but also what would it mean for Madame Nielsen to invite her own dying and her own killing if we think metaphorically? So what does it mean to redo oneself so radically so that sharing would be possible? And I think we can imagine radical form of undoing that are not physical deaths that would allow this to happen, that would allow us to inhabit the land and the territory under real equality. Can I say that I see them coming? Can I say that people, I can imagine actual concrete people in positions of power engaging in such process with a radical price that this entails? I'm not sure.
Rodrigo?
Just trying to find Camila. So in response to Camila, basically, I think you're absolutely right in what you say. At the same time, my impression, which is an impression I have as someone who hasn't worked with this concept of desamparo, hilflosigkeit, or helplessness, as it's known in Freudian theory. My impression, as someone who hasn't worked with the concept so much, is that there is a risk with it of it either explaining too much or too little. Too little in the sense that if I think there is a risk, or well, not necessarily a risk, but you know, I don't know if I would personally want to follow the concept too closely in terms of you know, the way it situates the experience in the relationship between the infant and the mother, etc., etc. So in that sense, it may be a bit too specific for my taste, the way it traces the experience of helplessness or if it's taken to trace the experience of helplessness to these specific situations in the life of an infant. On the other hand, I think it carries the risk of explaining too much, in the sense that it could be used in a way that just abbreviates the work of actually understanding the different mechanisms through which this helplessness is politically appropriated. What I mean by that is that in a way, or in every way, we're all helpless. But what makes it so that helplessness is mobilized in this way in one moment and in another way in another moment? And here, coming back to Carolina's earlier question, which I think I finally understand now, the question would be, for example, you know, what are exactly the mechanisms that explain the fact that in 2018 or 2014, which I think is when I wrote the text that she was referring to, social antagonism expressed itself, you know, in the wake of the 2013 protests, as an antagonism between the people and the political elite. And in 2018, when we had in Bolsonaro's election, both people and elite had changed content, and you had an opposition that nominally would seem to be the same, but actually had a completely different content. The people were now the upstanding citizen, the cidadão de bem, and the elite was understood as being the cultural elite or communists, and so on and so forth. So, you know, my point is just that we need to complement this idea of helplessness with other analytical tools, I think, to make it more operational. But at the moment, I actually have a student who's writing precisely on this concept. So I hope soon, through her, I will have been able to develop more interesting things to say on the subject.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. It's already 1:03 here in Rio. So I would like to thank you very much to our speakers today, Hagar, Kotef, Yannis Tavakakis, Rodrigo, Nunes, for sharing their thoughts with us. I think it has been a fascinating conversation. I also like to thank the interpreters for their job, which is really important for us, and the organizers at Esse as well, as usual. And I'd like to invite you all to come to our seminar tomorrow and on the following days. Tomorrow we'll have a discussion on capital love. Capitalism has been mentioned several times yesterday and today. We'll have a table to discuss just that, the affective attachments to capitalism and things like that with Samu Tomsik and Nain Nayatullah. And on Thursday, we'll have a table on planetary catastrophe with Deborah Danovsky, Robert Fletcher, and François Verger. And then we have a final table on Friday on violence in international politics with Rosana Reis, Katarina Kimball, and Andrea Zevnik. So I hope you can join us for the next days of our seminar. Thank you very much for coming.